A group of mothers in Rio de Janeiro gathers to ensure the names of their sons, killed during police raids, don't just fade into statistics. Writing for The Independent last week, Eleonore Hughes looks at how these women are turning private mourning into a public push for reparations. It's a shift from quiet sorrow to a sharp legal demand. Something different happens when the protest comes from the person willing to risk their own life. In a piece published yesterday, Ghazala Jamil looks at the history of hunger strikes and self-immolation. There's a haunting puzzle in how a body, through its very suffering, can become the final piece of leverage used to corner a government. Ana Paula Oliveira's son, Jonathan, was walking home from his grandmother's house in a Rio favela when a police officer shot him in the back. Writing for The Independent last week, Eleonore Hughes follows the way Oliveira and other grieving mothers have turned their private pain into a national political movement. Notice how these women are moving beyond protests to demand actual public funding for the psychological support that keeps them from falling apart.
United by grief, mothers in Brazil demand reparations after police killed their sons. A group of Brazilian mothers whose sons were killed by police are demanding a nationwide policy to support relatives of victims of state violence and are seeking public funding to finance their activities. The non-profit Crossfire Institute said 460 people died during police operations in Rio last year, the highest number since 2016, and a 52% increase from the previous year. Much like the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, a human rights organization created by women whose children were kidnapped by the military dictatorship that ruled Argentina from 1976 to 1983, Oliveira and her group draw attention to the pain generated by police killings and seek judicial accountability, sometimes successfully.
Last year, they travelled to the capital, Brasilia, and met with the judiciary, legislative and executive branches to present their project, developed with the support of RAVE, a network of organisations supporting people affected by police killings in Rio. RAVE is negotiating with the federal government to implement a pilot project developed by the mothers so that we can provide care and guarantee the rights of this population, said Guilherme Pimentel, a coordinator for RAVE. Turning grief into struggle. As in other Latin American countries, including Peru and Colombia, crime is a key issue for voters in Brazil's elections in October. Supporters and allies of presidential hopeful Sen Flávio Bolsonaro, son of former President Jair Bolsonaro, argue that police must be given full support in their fight against heavily armed gangs in favelas or impoverished, sprawling urban communities. But grieving mothers and non-profits contend that Brazil's police too often use excessive force, sometimes ending in death. Oliveira's son Jonathan was shot in the back as he passed through a street in Manguinhos favela in Rio after visiting his grandmother, his mother said. He later died of his injuries. Police officers allege that they shot him to disperse a crowd that was protesting, said Oliveira, who wants the law enforcement official who fired the shot convicted of intentional homicide. In 2024, a jury convicted the official of manslaughter without intent to kill. Prosecutors successfully appealed, but a new court date for a second trial hasn't been set. Like Oliveira, Monica Cunha also transformed her pain into activism.
After her 20-year-old son was killed by police in 2006, she became a councilwoman, and this month will launch her pre-candidacy to run for state lawmaker in the upcoming October elections. I fight for memory, truth, justice, reparations and guarantees of non-repetition, not only for myself, but so that no other family has to endure this pain, Cunha said in an Instagram post on the 18th anniversary of her son's death. The racism that kills our children and loved ones is not an isolated problem, and it must be confronted through state policies. I will keep going, turning grief into struggle. Brazilian police have killed more than 6,000 people every year since 2018, according to the Brazilian Forum on Public Safety, a prominent non-profit. The largest number of victims are aged 18 to 24, while 82% of victims of lethal police violence are black, the non-profit said in its 2025 annual publication on violence in Brazil. Anti-gang tactics in Rio's favelas came under scrutiny once again last year, when police killed 117 suspected gang members in the state's most lethal raid ever, targeting members of the criminal group Red Command in 2 favelas. 5 police officers also died. Officers arrested 113 people, seized 118 weapons, and confiscated more than a ton of drugs in that operation, police said. Then Rio Governor Claudio Castro, a Bolsonaro ally, defended the operation, which he said targeted narco-terrorists, a term echoing US President Donald Trump. Last month, the Trump administration classified the Red Command, as well as its rival First Command Capital, as foreign terrorist organizations. We need solutions. Nadia dos Santos' sons Clayton and Claverson were both killed by police, the former in 2015 when he was 18 and the latter when he was 17 in 2022.
Police also killed the son of her sister, Glaucia dos Santos, Fabricio, in 2014 when he was 17. A memorial honouring and depicting the 3 boys covers the front wall of the family's home in Rio's Chapadão complex of favelas. The sisters founded support groups and began the long work of investigating the circumstances of each boy's death, seeking accountability through the courts. In 2023, the police officers involved in the death of Fabricio were sentenced to 9 years in prison, a decision that was celebrated by other mothers and gave them hope, Glaucia dos Santos said. We want others to stay alive, so we have to stay upright, despite the immense toll of the grief, said Glaucia dos Santos. Her sister Nadia said the mothers need a nationwide public policy on restitution that she went to Brasilia to demand. The state should have the obligation to give us mothers who lose our sons because of the state's violence reparations. We fight, we work, but we become ill. We need solutions, she said. Oliveira suggested restitution could take the form of placing victims' names in public places and naming facilities after them, such as schools, hospitals, and daycare centres. There are other forms of reparation as well, such as building other public policies of non-repetition that would help prevent new cases. Many things need to be done, repaired, so that this barbarity does not continue, she said. Associated Press journalist Diale Rodriguez contributed to this report. Follow AP's coverage of Latin America and the Caribbean at https://apnews.com/hub/Latin America.
Ana Paula Oliveira stands in a school in Manguinhos, marking the anniversary of a son lost to a police bullet. That image from Eleonore Hughes leaves a specific weight, the idea that a death can be transformed into a ledger, a demand for reparations, and a reason for a community to refuse to disappear. It treats the loss of life as a debt the state hasn't paid. The shift to Ghazala Jamil's look at hunger strikes and self-immolation changes the math. Jamil moves the focus away from the survivors picking up the pieces and toward the protesters who use their own physical survival as a bargaining chip. Where the mothers in Rio fight to make the state acknowledge a death that already happened, the hunger striker forces the state to watch a death in slow motion. It's a different kind of leverage. Reading Jamil alongside Hughes, the observation surfaces that when the law fails, the body becomes the only evidence that can't be argued away. One piece uses grief to build a movement. The other uses the threat of grief to stop a machine. What emerges is the realization that in the face of absolute power, the most radical thing a person can do is refuse to let a death be quiet.
On February 25, 2024, Aaron Bushnell, a 25-year-old U.S. Air Force serviceman, walked to the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., dressed in military uniform, placed his phone on the ground to record himself, doused his body with flammable liquid, and set himself on fire. In a live broadcast before he immolated himself, Bushnell declared, "I will no longer be complicit in genocide. I am about to engage in an extreme act of protest. But compared to what people have been experiencing in Palestine at the hands of their colonizers, it's not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal. Free Palestine." He died hours later. Bushnell's act forced a moral and emotional confrontation that news cycles and diplomatic statements could not. It resonated globally because of the shocking nature of on-camera self-immolation, but also because of its political clarity. His body in flames brought an immediacy to the spectacle of witnessing. It indicted Israel's targeted bombings of civilians in the Gaza genocide and US complicity at a time when newsrooms were making abstract arguments about a complicated dispute. Bushnell joins a long and difficult lineage of those who have used self-sacrifice, especially self-inflicted death, as a form of political dissent. From Bhagat Singh's embrace of martyrdom under British colonial rule to self-immolating monks in Vietnam, from Rohit Vemula and numerous other Dalit activists and farmers in India to Arab Spring suicides, the act of publicly choosing death has functioned as a radical political intervention. Yet such acts disturb us because they inhabit a paradox. Why do some in society grant these acts extraordinary moral weight, while others dismiss them as pathological or futile? What can we gain in understanding self-sacrifice, including self-immolation and other suicidal acts, as a form of political dissent? Can the deliberate destruction of one's own being become a claim to political agency? Self-sacrificial protest has a vocabulary rooted in many cultures. In Ireland, hunger strikes were used as an assertion of dignity against colonial repression, but drew from the tradition of striking outside a debtor's house, which was seen to bring dishonor to a debtor. In India, the Gandhian tradition of fast until death or hunger strikes, although not suicidal, drew from a similar lineage of ascetic tradition, but also invoked traditions of sit-in protests in Jainism and Buddhism. The idea seems to be that the suffering body demands a moral reckoning which cannot be ignored. Of all forms of self-endangerment and dissent, the hunger strike became one of the most widespread and culturally resonant political protests in the 20th century. It involves voluntary refusal of food and sometimes water to the point of severe debility or even death. Hunger strikers inflict suffering only on themselves. Therefore, it has often been framed as an ethical appeal from a position of powerlessness. By choosing to undergo pain rather than inflict it, hunger strikers claim a moral high ground. Their deliberate suffering highlights the injustice of what they are protesting against and can evoke public sympathy, shame authorities, and rally support, as many observers have noted. In modern democracies especially, a person starving in protest presents a profound dilemma. Authorities must either accede to the demand, force-feed the protester, raising human rights concerns, or risk letting them die and facing public outrage. One early precedent came from the struggle for women's suffrage in Britain. Suffragettes, jailed for protests, began to use hunger strikes as a means to protest their incarceration and mistreatment. British authorities responded with forcible feeding, a brutal procedure that only heightened public sympathy for the striking women. One of them, Emily Wilding Davison, who died in another risky protest in 1913, had said that a life would have to be given before the vote was won, effectively predicting that a martyrdom would galvanize the movement. After her death, the movement did revere her as a martyr. M.K. Gandhi was the most famous exponent of the political hunger strike. He undertook at least 20 fasts for various purposes. He saw fasting as part of his philosophy of satyagraha, insisting upon truth, and a means to purify oneself and appeal to the conscience of opponents and the public. Gandhi explicitly called the fast a great weapon in the armory of satyagraha, a powerful tool which, if used with genuine self-sacrificial spirit, could move hearts more effectively than any sword. This usage underscored that the hunger striker's suffering was meant to embody the suffering of others and thus spur ethical action. Gandhi was accused of coercion even during his lifetime, but he insisted that his fasts were acts of self-purification meant to merit a response. Nonetheless, the political impact of his fasts until death was real both for the British government as well as the Indian publics. Another notable case was that of Jatin Das, who fasted to protest the abusive treatment of political prisoners in 1929. His hunger strike lasted 63 days and ended in his death, which sent shockwaves through India. The 24-year-old's funeral procession in Calcutta drew massive crowds and galvanized anti-colonial sentiment. Much like Terence McSweeney's hunger strike in Ireland in 1920-21, Jatin Das's death in custody highlighted colonial injustices to the world. Bhagat Singh, the famous revolutionary, and his comrade Batukeshwar Dutt also undertook a long hunger strike in jail that same year to demand equal rights for Indian prisoners. Though Bhagat Singh was eventually executed by hanging, the very image of these young men willingly courting death for dignity turned them into heroes in the public eye. It established a template in the Indian imagination that dying for a just cause confers martyrdom and moral victory, even in defeat. After independence, Indian activists continued to see fasting as a legitimate protest method. Perhaps the most consequential hunger strike after independence was that of Poti Sri Ramulu in 1952. Sri Ramulu was a Gandhian who undertook a fast unto death, demanding the creation of a separate Telugu-speaking state, Andhra, out of the Madras state. Despite appeals from leaders, Sri Ramulu's fast stretched week after week. After 56 days without food, Sri Ramulu died on December 15, 1952. Riots and mass protests erupted across Andhra regions upon news of his death. Faced with this uproar, Nehru's government had to give in and announce the formation of the Andhra state. Sri Ramulu was immediately hailed as Amarjeevi, immortal being, by Telugu speakers, and his body was venerated in a ceremonial funeral. Elsewhere in the world too, hunger strikes continued to punctuate many political conflicts. During the Troubles in Northern Ireland, imprisoned Irish Republican militants turned to hunger strikes to protest their prison conditions and to demand recognition as political prisoners. In 1981, Bobby Sands and 9 other members of the Provisional Irish Republican Army went on a hunger strike. Their protest was reported the world over. The Pope and several world leaders appealed to Britain's Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher to relent or negotiate. Sands survived 66 days without food. He was elected to the British Parliament during his strike, but all 10 strikers died in their protest. The strikers' deaths spurred Irish Republican sentiment, drew sympathy to their cause, and is often credited with boosting the Sinn Féin party's political prominence. The Irish hunger strikers explicitly framed themselves as martyrs in a long tradition of Irish resistance, echoing Terence McSweeney's ethos that unyielding suffering could be a weapon. As a matter of fact, a hunger strike has consistently been the choice of protest method among political prisoners in authoritarian regimes, where any other form of protest is impossible. In 2000, hundreds of prisoners across Turkey began what they called a death fast against the introduction of harsh high-security prison cells. This campaign lasted for years, with participants fasting in relays or to death. By some counts, over 100 people eventually died in this protracted protest. Political theorist Banu Bargu, in her book Starve and Immolate, The Politics of Human Weapons, chronicled how these Turkish hunger strikers viewed their bodies as their final weapon against state power. Bargu notes a politics of human weapons at play. When denied any tools of resistance, the protesters weaponized their very lives, using the slow violence of self-starvation to indict the regime. Often states assert control over bodies and life through tactics like detentions and force-feeding, such as in the case of Iram Sharmila, who conducted a remarkable 16-year hunger strike against military abuses in northeast India. The Turkish case, like others, raised difficult ethical questions about force-feeding and state responsibility. But it also demonstrated how even the most marginalized dissenters can gain agency and international attention through strategic self-suffering. Excerpted with permission from What to Do with Political Sadness and other essays on death, destruction and hauntology. Ghazala Jamil, Simon & Schuster, India.
A mother in Rio de Janeiro stands before a judge, her son's name painted on a banner. Somewhere else, a person sits in a quiet room and pushes away a plate of food. These acts turn the silence of death into a loud, public call for change. What's left to sit with is the image of a body, or the memory of one, being the only way to be heard when every other door is locked. If a person's most private grief becomes a public demand, what does that cost the one who has to live it?